Just do that. That's what I think every time I hear Dr. Woods talk about how to make presentations memorable. Just do that. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. First, for those who don't know who Dr. Nicole Woods is, I should let her introduce herself.
My name is Dr. Nicole Woods. I am an education scientist and the Institute Director for the Institute for Education Research at UHN. In my work, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and so my research program tries to take principles of learning and memory and attention and awareness and apply them to contemporary problems in health professions education.
In the before times, Dr. Woods was one of the instructors at the Wilson Center Say Something presentation workshops. And although her lecture came early in the 2-day program, I was always tempted just to wrap up the workshop there with "just do that" as my only contribution. What makes this odd is she only really discusses one aspect of presentations, memory, yet by doing so, she makes it abundantly clear how fundamental memorable content is to any presentation, a fact often overlooked, at times overlooked even by Dr. Woods herself. Quite a few years ago, Dr. Woods and I were working on a presentation she was giving at an unfortunately named Education Day called Resident as Teacher Day, or RAT Day for short. And what struck me about this particular teaching presentation was how little it incorporated what I had already learned from Dr. Woods.
So when I was first asked to give the talk, it was a hand-me-down talk. Other presenters had given it before. I was new to the department, and they said, "Here, it's your turn to give this talk." And the topic was definitely memory related. It was all about how students learn, how students retain information, and really that's what memory is. But the talk itself touched on nothing that had to do with human memory.
So even when presentations are about teaching, how memorable the content is just isn't a consideration.
It's true, and it's funny now in hindsight, but honestly, I often go along with it as well. We talk about teaching and learning, but we don't talk about memory. We see them as distinct things. When we talk about teaching, we think we have to talk about teachers. And so we think we have to talk about teaching strategies and teaching tips and teaching tools. But in other ways of thinking about learning, especially from cognitive psychology, teaching, learning, it is memory, literally. And if you teach someone something and they forget it tomorrow, what was the point of teaching it? So it has to be linked to human memory. And the nice thing about it really is that we know so much about human memory. So really it's a missed opportunity for us not to blend those two disciplines and those two fields and ways of thinking. It's really a mistake. By focusing solely on the teaching and excluding everything we know about human memory, you're missing on a chance to build on this robust evidence base to advance your teaching.
And although we tend to think of teaching and presenting as distinct, there's no clear way or place to draw that line, especially when we look at the role memory plays in making a presentation effective.
It's true. And when we think of academic presentations or any type of presentations, we tend to take our teacher hat off and do our presenter mode. And when we present, sometimes we forget that the goal wasn't just to stand up there and look good. It was to share information in ways that people can use it, right? They have to be able to use it. And if they're going to be able to use it, then they have to be able to remember it, right? So you don't want people to just remember that you presented. You hopefully want them to remember what you said at some level. If you're saying something important, then you want them to remember what you said.
The goal is to share information in a way that people can use it. Dr. Woods mentions this in the context of making content memorable, but really, how's this not the guiding principle for all presentations? What presentation wouldn't be significantly improved if the presenter had asked themselves, is this content useful? But as Dr. Woods will shortly point out, focusing on the utility of the content is really just the first step. Actually, it's the step before the first step, a prelude to a step.
I think you start with memory, and that means you start with meaning. The easiest way to remember something is to attach meaning to it. So the reason that's important, we always say this in psychology, memory is a reconstructive process. So we think of memory sometimes as something where I put this information into a little container, and when I need it, I pull it back out again. But that's actually not how memory works. Memory works as when you need information, your brain has to reconstruct it. It's going to try to rebuild it all over again. And the way your brain does that is by using meaningful cues, meaningful connections. And so the fastest way, even if you know nothing else about human memory, the fastest way to ensure that your material is memorable is to ensure that it has some meaning, that there's meaning attached to it. And the meaning has to be for the audience, not for you as a presenter, but ensure that your audience is able to attain and understand some meaning?
The first step is to make it meaningful. Although I'm not sure how literal Dr. Woods is when she says start with meaning, it would unquestionably benefit academic presentations if they absolutely took it literally. I've often noticed how long it takes academic presentations to start. After the pleasantries, formalities, disclaimers, introductions, objectives, and meandering backgrounds, it's ridiculous how long it can be before it's even possible to guess what the point is, assuming there is one. We would do much better to follow Dr. Woods' recommendations and start with meaning. Now, of course, as Dr. Woods stated, it has to be meaningful, not just for the presenter, but for the audience. To help with this, she introduces us to the semantic network, a model cognitive psychologists use to frame human knowledge and memory.
And you can think of a semantic network as a way of mapping out what could be in someone's mind. And so it's a set of abstract concepts and specific experiences, all kind of held together in memory. And so a network essentially has two components. One is the nodes. And so the nodes represent kind of features of a particular item or features of a particular memory or concept. The other piece are connectors. And the connectors are really important because they hold all the nodes together into a coherent package. So when I say that you can have isolated facts versus meaningful connected memories, what I mean is that you can either help someone develop a bunch of random nodes that are all kind of laid out in space and not linked to each other, or you can try to help them develop maybe even a smaller number of nodes that are all tightly connected. And the connections are the most important part. If you don't have those connections, the whole network just kind of falls apart on you. The connections hold it together. They help you be able to make faster decisions. And more importantly, for this context, the number of connections, the richness of the connections, and the depth of connections will determine how well you recall the information later on. Really, the connections determine the durability of the semantic network. Things that are isolated will be quickly forgotten. Things that are tightly connected will be easier to reconstruct later on when you need them.
The connections are the most important part. So often presentations consist of far too many nodes and far too few connectors. In the worst cases, they feel like they're all nodes and no connectors, just lists of isolated facts. Instead of focusing on the things we feel we need to say, presenters should make sure that there are clear and robust connections between all of their ideas, concepts, and data.
That's it. I think that we make that mistake very often in talks. We think it's really, really important that I say these 15,000 things. But what's the point in saying all 15,000 if they're going to be forgotten? It is much more powerful and much more impactful and more meaningful if you set people up to learn a fewer number of nodes, just develop that smaller network, but it's tightly connected. And the key thing here is that not only will it be more memorable, but allows them to acquire new knowledge as they move forward. So if I start with a smaller, really tightly connected network, it's really easy for me to acquire another node when I encounter some related content, right? I can just bring that new node into my network and build it in. But if I just had a whole bunch of isolated nodes and some of them were forgotten after the talk and some of them were never really that well established anyway, even if I encounter some new information that's really important, I won't be able to bring it in to my connecting network, right? And so chances are, no matter what you're presenting today, ideally, people are supposed to be able to use this in their practice or use this in their day-to-day lives, but also they'll probably have a chance to build on it later on. They probably aren't going to learn everything they need to know about this topic in your 30-minute presentation. They're going to want to learn later, and so you want to set them up to do so.
This idea that a presentation should or even could set people up for future engagement with content is a unique combination of obvious, brilliant, and oddly absent from conversations about presentations. Of course, presentations exist within a continuum, and of course they'd be better if that was taken into account, yet so many presentations come across as though they're intended to be experienced in isolation, complete unto themselves. Dr. Woods reminds us, no presentation is an island. This connection that Dr. Woods draws between meaningful and memorable also highlights some pretty common misconceptions about how we make content memorable. One of the most common of these is the presumed effectiveness of repetition.
Yeah, it's one of those really disappointing facts of the way the world works, right? Like you think to yourself, repetition would have to help. If I just do this again and again and again, if I repeat this grocery store list over and over and over again to myself, I'll remember it. And what we know from many, many experiments in cognition is that repetition doesn't help nearly as much as you think it's going to, and sometimes it hurts. So sometimes it goes even worse. So I'll give you a really easy everyday example that we use all the time. And it is similar to the grocery store list or other kind of everyday experiences. So if I ask you to dial a phone number, and this is one of those rare times where for some reason you can't write it down, you can't put it in your phone, right? So just bear with me. And you have to remember a phone number. And I say it to you, and you say, okay, I've got the number, and you repeat it to yourself. And you repeat the number again and again and again until you get to a phone and dial it. And that's what most people would do, right? They just keep repeating the number, dial it, have the conversation. At the end of that conversation, what are the chances you're going to remember that number? Pretty much zero. You're not going to remember the number. It's going to be gone. And it doesn't matter if you repeated that number 100 times between the time you left me and the time you got to that phone. It is very unlikely you're going to remember that phone number. So what we know is that repetition is not nearly as powerful as we would like it to be for the purpose of human memory. And when I say that it can sometimes hurt, is that sometimes when you are so used to seeing something over and over and over again, when something repeats itself over and over and over again, you stop seeing it. Your brain learns, I don't actually have to remember this because it's just going to come up again. So why would I waste valuable memory storage space on something that's just going to happen again? And so you forget it. And so seeing something again and again and again can sometimes make it less likely that you remember what that thing is, right? And so we have to keep that in mind as presenters, as teachers, as parents sometimes, that simply repeating something over and over and over again is not sufficient to make sure that people will remember it after the fact.
So when we try and do this to either our brain or an audience, two things will likely occur. It won't be very effective, and no one will be very happy it's happening. Dr. Woods talked about how ineffective repetition is, but I think it's also worth noting how unpleasant it is. This also extends to how we prepare for presentations. Many presenters practice their presentation over and over again, struggling and never really acknowledging that their impossible to remember presentation will be no more memorable or pleasant for the audience to experience than it was for them to prepare. This isn't to say that a memorable presentation doesn't require any rehearsal, or in fact repetition. Here, Dr. Woods explains the difference between rote repetition and the more robust concept of recurrence.
So what we want to do is use repetition as a tool to create meaning. And in that way, you can turn repetition into a really powerful tool for human memory. So you don't want to repeat the exact same thing again and again and again. But what if I show version A first, and then version B, and then version C, and I repeat it, but I change it just a little bit every single time. I build on it just a little bit every single time. In that way, I can actually aid human memory. I can teach people something important about the differences between those versions by showing them. And I can also draw attention to the fact that, hey, this thing is slightly changing. Pay attention over here. It's important. So now I can drive attention and I can demonstrate meaning with the repetition. But that's very different than showing the exact same item over and over and over again, which will tell the brain, stop looking at this thing because it's never going to change, right? Those are very different things. So when we work in teaching, what we do is we talk about kind of a spiral curriculum. We want concepts to keep coming back and building. And I would say for presentations, it's the same thing. There's nothing wrong with having concepts recur in a presentation, but you're doing so intentionally and you know what it is that you want people to pull from that repetition. And you would have to vary it slightly to draw attention to that fact.
Throughout all of Dr. Woods' insights on presentations, it becomes clear that presentations and memory are deeply linked, meaning that which works well for memory works well for presentations. Meaningful presentations are memorable, and memorable presentations are meaningful. And as obvious as that possibly should be, after all, meaning and memory are the only material result of a presentation. Dr. Woods' clear and precise way of illustrating it highlights how often we as presenters fail to remember it. Putting it together, Dr. Woods leaves us with an utterly succinct approach to creating memorable presentations.
Get down to your core concepts that you really want to engage your audience with. And that's an intentionally chosen word on my part. You want them to engage with you on this material. Just choose a few of them and you can have them recur. And each time you're adding more depth. You are contrasting between your concepts. You are helping them understand why I brought all three of these things, 3 or 4, whatever it is, together. And by the end of the presentation, they've developed a rich understanding of those 4 things or 3 things or whatever it is. Actually, technically it's one thing because it's all connected, but they have a rich understanding of it and they can go on and learn more. Right? Maybe they'll ask you some questions, maybe they'll invite you back. You never really know, right? But that's really the goal here.
So following Dr. Wood's recommendation means we would arrange our useful content in such a way that it helps audiences establish meaningful and memorable connections, so that they can in turn build on these connections and continue to benefit far beyond the limited experience of our particular presentation. Yes, just do that.